When you visit Poland or any other older Eastern Bloc countries, you still see the remains of the Soviet buildings. But how did planners decide the design?
Every New Year's Eve, millions of Russians sit down to watch the 1976 romantic comedy, The Irony of Fate. It's a national tradition. In the movie, the protagonist ends up drunk and in Leningrad, unaware that he has taken a plane from Moscow. He gets into a taxi and tells the driver his address in Moscow. It turns out there's a street with that same name in Leningrad, and the building at the address is the exact same as well. The protagonist stumbles into the building and finds that his key works in the lock to what he thinks is his apartment. He doesn't notice any minor differences and falls asleep in someone else's bed. I don't want to spoil the entire movie here, but you can imagine what hijinks and romance ensue after this epic mix-up.
I'm assuming that happens. Obviously, it's probably slightly exaggerated, but because when the Soviets built, they built in a certain way and everything looked the same. Almost like in the UK now, new build homes, they all look the same. They're all the same colour, they're all the same size, they're all the same shape, all the same thin thickness of the walls. I think the fact that the key probably fits still, that might be an over-exaggeration, but I may be wrong.
But the whole joke is based on the reality of Soviet housing. It's so standardized that a scenario like this is plausible. The cherry on top is this movie's introduction, which explains how the Soviet Union got to be this way. It depicts a local architect's designs overridden by the central state, which then proceeds to place the exact same nondescript housing blocks in every part of the USSR, regardless of climate. I wish more romantic comedies hinged on some planning subplot like this. Russia, you're lucky. We get stuck with movies like Love Actually. Ugh.
Love Actually is amazing.
This movie confirms a stereotype that a lot of people have about Russia and countries in the former communist bloc. When you think about Russian cities, those cold, plain, mid to high-rise buildings are what come to mind. They're often set in nondescript landscapes on the edge of cities.
See, that is exactly, it's not that he's saying Russia, but actually I think he's meaning the old Eastern Bloc, right? Which Soviets occupied. But actually, even when we fly into Poland, we see these. Not quite, well, no, you do see these. I was going to say not quite to this extent, and maybe not quite to this extent, because obviously Poland was on the far end of it. But you see this, as you fly in, on outside of the cities, these blocks are what you see, and they're normally in like U shapes. So we'll find out why. What was so good or bad about them?
In this video, we'll learn more about how the elimination of private property, dedication to providing housing for all, and the encouragement of communal living led to very different cities in the Soviet Union when compared to Western counterparts. For those needing a very brief history lesson, the Soviet Union, more formally known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, existed from 1922 to 1991. The Soviet Union was a byproduct of the 1917 Russian Revolution, where Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the successor government to the Romanov constitutional monarchy. The Bolshevik government instituted state socialism with strong central government authority over local planning. They believed that the physical form of cities should reinforce the principles of Soviet socialism, and cities should be reimagined with that goal in mind. Private property was eliminated, and all land was in control of the central state. As you can imagine, these changes would have a profound impact on how cities would be planned, designed, and built. But it's important to know that the Soviet Union, at its apex, controlled 1/6 of the total land area on the planet. It spanned 11 time zones in 2 continents in its 69-year history. I'm going to be speaking about Soviet city planning very generally, but it's important to know that regional variations existed and ideas evolved through time. It's fascinating to compare cities in Estonia, which had a lot of contact with Western Europe, to cities deep in Russian territory. That's a topic for maybe another video. Soviet city planning in the 1920s and 1930s, at the beginning of the Soviet Union, focused on the transition from private property to state control of land, as well as early attempts at creating cities according to socialist principles.
What happened if you owned property, if you owned a house before the Soviets came into power? What happened to your property? Did they reimburse you, or did they just say, unlucky, it's not yours anymore? What actually happened? Do you guys know? They may end up saying, but would be if they end up just taking it, not giving you anything, you think, what the? This was mine, and now it's not. So maybe those people would certainly be disgruntled.
Architects and planners at the time championed a form of modern architecture known as Constructivism. The austere, industrial, functional design was a perfect fit for planners and architects tasked with providing housing for millions of people. In fact, Russia had its own university for teaching modernist architecture, which closely paralleled the more famous Bauhaus in Germany. Many constructivist ideas came from this school, and it had influence beyond the Iron Curtain. The basic principle of Soviet city design of this era was that everyone should be spending their time outside in communal environments, working, eating, socializing, and so on. Thus, Soviet housing was built with the barest minimum of living space. The result was buildings that were basically dormitories, and that's how they are used today. They were built in the constructivist style, so they were not only small, but plain. Perhaps unsurprisingly, living full-time in industrial-style dorm rooms was not popular with the general public. This phase did not last long. The next prominent apartment building type is often referred to as the Stalinka.
I just want to go back to that point of that they built houses in the idea to keep people outside, to work, eat, socialize. Because like when people under Soviet rule ate, it was quite often in communal areas, canteens and things, which you see films about. But if you do think, a lot of Russia is quite cold. This is the difference when we've been to Poland. Poland seems to be either really cold or really hot. Whereas somewhere like the UK, it's sort of somewhere in between and wet. So do people really want to be spending a lot of time outside when it is so cold? No, surely not.
As they came to be associated with the Stalin era from about 1930 to 1950, they came in two flavors. Smaller cinder block structures were built for the working class, while larger brick buildings with ornamentation were for the Communist Party elite.
You see that a lot now.
The larger Stalinkas aged gracefully and represented some of the finest state-constructed housing in the history of the Soviet Union. These housing units were prized right up through the fall of the USSR. Soviet city planning stalled during World War II, as most of the state's resources were dedicated to rebuilding industry and rebuilding cities in the years that followed. The next big epoch in Soviet planning came after Nikita Khrushchev came into power after Stalin's death. Khrushchev had an interest in domestic policy and reform, and housing was high on his list of concerns. His interest came from when he was the head of the Communist Party in Moscow. In 1950, he led a large-scale housing construction project in the city. His interest was building many homes and quickly. Khrushchev and his architects and planners developed a standard building type that came to be known as Khrushchevkas. They were all 5 stories tall because elevators would be needed for buildings any taller, and elevators weren't in the budget.
All over Poland. Actually, last time I was in Warsaw, that is exactly the type of building I stayed in. And obviously they had converted it, so part of it was for from bookings.com, but obviously they were houses. But that could be literally where I stayed. And it was about 5 stories tall. That is amazing because that is exactly what it was. But it wasn't very big, wasn't very light and airy. It wasn't amazing.
They were built out of prefabricated concrete panels, and a team of builders could assemble a Khrushchevka in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Units in these buildings were small, though not as small as the constructivist dorms of the past. A 1-bedroom unit was 30 square meters, and a 3-bedroom unit was double that. Kitchens were tiny, only 6 square meters. These may have been perfectly sized for a small family, but in reality, they often housed multi-generational households. When Khrushchev became leader of the entire Soviet Union, he scaled up the Russian housing program to the entire nation. At the peak of the program, 60 million people lived in Khrushchevkas. That's the entire population of Italy, all living in essentially the same buildings. The Communist Party was not against ornamentation or beauty, but their priority was ubiquity and equality. The Soviet Union had promised all of its citizens a home, and the only way they could do that was with mass production of very few building plans. These building plans were polarizing amongst the public. Many hoped for more amenities or a larger unit, while others grew to love them.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, oh wow, they look cool. I'll show you in a second. At the end of the day, yes, at least they are trying to give everyone a house, Whereas nowadays, you do see so many homeless people on the streets struggling and don't have anywhere to live. Now, would they be happy to have an apartment like this? Probably. You know, whereas me, who owns a home, I would not be happy to own a property like that. So it's good that everyone has a house to live in, but you always want more. That's the issue, isn't it?
The Soviet government often
There
compared
you
them
go.
to
How cool
US
are they?
public housing, which were eventually inhabited by very low-income households. The buildings often lacked maintenance and policing. The Khrushchevkas were for everyone and were better kept. The Communist Party used this point to highlight how their political and social systems were better than those of the West. I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about housing. Housing was critically important to the Communist Party's socialist agenda, but there are other aspects to Soviet city planning as well. I mean, what kind of neighborhood did all those Khrushchevkas create? The answer was the mikrorayon, which translates to micro-district in English, so that's the word I'm going to use instead of butchering that word over and over again. Micro-districts were the urban building blocks of new Soviet cities and the additions to existing ones. They were areas of around 10 to 60 hectares that housed around 20,000 people.
Hectares.
They also included senior centers, childcare, schools, shops, and restaurants. The idea was that everything a person needed on a daily basis, except work, would be within 500 meters of a resident's home.
See, that's a brilliant idea, isn't it? And I know they try and do that, like in the UK now, when they build new build housing estates, they, you have to have certain things. You have to have like schools, you have to have shops, you have to have a playground. So I think this similar idea is coming in for sure. But this is what you see, that those U shapes, and it's almost like its own little district. Even that is its own little district. And so in that sense, it is a good idea because you don't have to go far. You have that little community. It's that community feel. The realities of it, I don't know. That's the difference. It's all good saying about how you think it's going to be and how it actually ends up being and how people think about it and feel and what their living is really like.
Microdistricts would also include things residents needed less frequently, such as healthcare facilities. But not every microdistrict would have one. They were spaced such that a resident would be no further than 1,500 meters from it. Microdistricts were typically surrounded by arterial streets. They were designed so that residents could access everything in their microdistrict on foot. Arterial streets carried car, bus, and tram traffic. Residents were expected to use mass transit when moving throughout the larger city, such as on their commute to work. While the Soviet government was more centralized than Western ones, Soviet cities were less centralized. Western cities in the 1950s and 1960s were designed to move people from the suburbs to the central city and back again. Soviet cities were designed to move residents from any one point to any other point. Many new Soviet cities were built around a mine or steel mill, so most workers weren't commuting to the center anyway. Microdistricts were critical to the realization of the socialist city. They were called the smallest administrative unit in the Soviet reorganization of urban territory. They were designed so that everyone would have the same housing and access to all of the same amenities. No microdistrict would be any better than any other. And because Soviet cities were less centralized, it wasn't like microdistricts closer to the city center necessarily gave those residents a shorter commute. The self-contained unit of the microdistrict was perfect for adding on to a city almost indefinitely. As new employment uses, such as offices or factories, popped up, new microdistricts could be added to the edge of the city like simple building blocks. After Khrushchev came Brezhnev, and some of the laser focus on efficiency and standardization fell to the wayside. If you see Soviet apartment buildings taller than 5 stories, they were probably built after 1964, when Brezhnev was in power. There was still standardization, this was still the Soviet Union, but there was also more consideration of climate and local conditions. Instead of one standardized apartment building, there were several. As Soviet cities began to expand outward, planners began to value density. New apartment buildings were now 9 to 16 stories and included elevators. The units themselves were larger and nicer than those in Khrushchevkas, but smaller than the Stalinkas. This model of planning lasted until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Soviet cities show how different urban form can be if the underlying societal goals are different. The Soviet Union's socialist perspective called for the elimination of private property, encouragement of communal living, and housing for all. The result is mass-produced apartment buildings and standardized urban districts with pedestrian access to all daily activities, save work. This video is not meant to be an endorsement or critique of this city type. I will say that it's amazing that, love it or hate it, Soviet citizens find the time every New Year's to laugh about it. Hey, if you want to...
Very, very interesting that there was different types throughout the running of the countries and the different governments or the leaders of the governments. Was it a government? You know what I mean? But actually, it's an interesting one because, like I said, there are pros and cons. Like at the end of the day, by what it sounds like, everyone had a home. And that's important. Everyone needs a home. But if everyone has to have the same, then there is sort of surely the work ethic is lowered because there's no reason to work harder because what you get is the same as everyone else. You can't work harder to earn more, which surely isn't good for the workforce and morale of people, is it? Because there's no, yeah, there's no drive for initiative. You know, you can't. There's no reason to invent things or to create your own businesses because you can't. I don't think. So it's sort of good in one aspect and obviously clearly bad in another. But that's the same with everything, right? The current system at the moment in the UK and most other countries. At the end of the day, we don't have enough homes, so people are homeless. You know, when new build houses are built, they're too expensive, and therefore people can't afford to buy them. Um, but you can have bigger houses, you can have smaller houses, you can have what you can afford, I suppose, and you can always strive to have more and be bigger. So there's pros and cons for sure, and that was really really interesting, especially to see that they looked mostly the same, but actually they were different through each of the leaders' reigns. Interesting. Interesting. Do you live in one of these Soviet blocks? How do you like it? Are you happy with it? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will catch you next time. Do widzenia.